Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. From a military and trade-focused alliance to a global comprehensive strategic one. The summit between South Korean President Yoon and U.S. President Joe Biden resulted in wide-ranging outcomes. One of the highlights was the Washington Declaration, which aims to enhance the credibility of the United States' extended deterrence commitment to Seoul. Cooperation in other sectors like cybersecurity and high-tech industries, too, were also included. To help us delve deeper into the summit between Seoul and Washington, we have Eric Kim, adjunct professor of business administration at UNIST and CEO of DataCrunch Global, into the studio. Professor Kim, good to see you.
Good to see you.
And we also have Professor Robert Kelly at Busan National University. Professor Kelly, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
All right, first question. Now, before we tap on the specifics of the summit, how would our Professor Kelly and our Professor Kim evaluate the summit overall? Could you start us off, Professor Kelly?
Sure. I think overall it was a pretty good success, right? I mean, you got Yoon out there doing karaoke on TV. I mean, I would say it's pretty good, right? I mean, it's pretty clear that President Biden and Yoon like each other. They get along. That's a far cry from where things were a few years ago when Donald Trump and Moon Jae-in really just loathed each other and didn't really even like talking with each other very much, right? I mean, this is one of Yoon's promises of the candidate who can bring the alliance back and things like that. I think this trip was really a part of that. I think this is a big effort of sort of his argument to the Korean public about why he's president, that he's sort of done these things and he's spending all this time in D.C. He's going to speak to Congress. So all in all, in terms of the optics, in terms of the relationship, in terms of getting things back on a better footing than they were for a while, I think all of that is there. I think the debates about the decision, the Nuclear Consultative Group and sort of South Korea agreeing not to build nuclear weapons, that's going to shake out in South Korean public in the next couple of weeks. We've already seen that Chosun Ilbo object that this was given away too easily and stuff like that. But I think on the broad range of issues, I think there was a lot of comedy and they seem to get along well. And so it's pretty good. I mean, all in all, I think it's been a good event.
Right, I see. Now, how about you, Professor Kim? How was your view on the summit?
I think there were very interesting keywords that came out from the summit. In the opening ceremony, Joe Biden emphasized "we go together," symbolizing the importance of the ROK-U.S. alliance both in the security domain and in the economic domain. And President Yoon sang a karaoke
right.
of singing American Pie, symbolizing Korea's first salesman. So it was symbolized as both a very important economic alliance and also a security alliance that we cannot separate in the discussion.
Right. Now, Professor Kelly, President Yoon and Biden announced a Washington Declaration agreeing to launch a new Nuclear Consultative Group, like you said before, aiming to have immediate bilateral presidential consultations in the event of a North Korean nuclear attack. Now, NATO's Nuclear Planning Group has reportedly been used as a reference point. What is the significance of the NCG?
Right. So we have to wait to see just how much the South Koreans are actually going to have a role in this, just how deep South Korea will be invited into war games and planning. I mean, President Biden already stated a certain limit, right, at the event, right, when he said, I retain the sole authority and I alone retain the sole authority to deploy nuclear weapons, right? I mean, what he's basically signaling there is that South Koreans can be a part of this, but it's ultimately the Americans who will decide about whether or not we use nuclear weapons in response to what North Korea does. And this is this is really the core issue, right? I mean, this is why you've had this debate in South Korea for the last year or so about whether South Korea should build its own nuclear weapons because ultimately they want the authority to sort of defend themselves, right? And I think this is what the agreement is trying to sort of paper over. I think it narrowed that gap somewhat, right? I mean, inviting the South Koreans in deeper will reassure the South Korean government, the military perhaps a little bit more. I'm not sure if it completely pushes the issue or sort of wraps up the issue because we know the North Koreans, we know the North Koreans are going to continue to build. They're going to build more missiles. They're going to build more nuclear weapons. They're going to deploy new technologies. And so we're going to continue to have this debate between the U.S. and South Korea about just how committed is the United States at the risk of a nuclear strike by North Korea on the U.S., just how committed is the United States to ROK security. And this consultative group is kind of designed to sort of paper that over and kind of close that gap. But, we'll have to see how well that works, right? I have the feeling, to be honest, it won't work, Terry Lou. I have the feeling in 5 years when North Korea tests some even bigger nuclear weapon, we'll be having this debate once again. But, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, we don't know too much the details of what it's going to look like and how it's going to work.
Right, I see. Now, Professor, the declaration also included the deployment of U.S. strategic assets to the peninsula to be made constantly and routinely. Now, what significance does this have?
Right. That's that's reassurance, right? I mean, that's signaling to South Korea, right, that we stand with you, that if things get hot, if things go kinetic, the Americans are there and we're going to fight. And that also signals to the same thing to the North Koreans, right, which is that don't think you can use nuclear weapons as a way to wedge the Americans and the South Koreans apart, right, when it's pretty clear that that's exactly why the North Koreans built these weapons, right, and that's been a part of the nuclear weapons debate in South Korea for the last year. And all of this, I think the Americans really wanted this from this trip. All of this is designed from the American side to push back on this, and that's what the consultative group hopefully will do, right? It encourages the South Koreans to calm down and not worry so much, and encourages the North Koreans not to think that they can use nuclear weapons to split the alliance.
Right. Now, Professor Kelly, I believe that you have already mentioned this part, but I'd like to ask you once more. Now, included in the declaration was President Yoon's reaffirmation of Seoul's long-standing commitment to its obligations under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, meaning it has for now given concessions regarding having nuclear weapons of its own. Should we consider this as the most realistic choice for Seoul to make for now, or could this issue of deploying its own nukes surface yet again if Pyongyang continues its serious provocations?
Yeah, I think it will. I do. I mean, we've already sort of actually, this is the second time in South Korean history that we've gone through this, right? Back in the 70s, Park Chung-hee considered building nuclear weapons, and the Americans were able to sort of buy that off by making greater commitments to South Korean security. That's basically, it seems like, we're waiting to see what's going to happen from this summit. But it looks like that's what happened this time, that once again, the Americans made these commitments, greater commitments to South Korean security, and that will sort of head off the debate in South Korea again, at this time. I mean, the difference between now and the 70s is that now North Korea has a nuclear arsenal that can strike the United States, and that arsenal will almost certainly grow, right? There's no signaling at all from North Korea that they're going to show any kind of restraint, that they're going to cap, they're going to limit. In fact, the other direction, North Korea is building tactical nuclear weapons, it looks like, and things like that. And so the debate, the North Korean challenge, the North Korean nuclear and missile challenge that has led to this debate isn't going to go away. That's why I sort of argued that this thing is kind of trying to paper over that and try to find a sort of compromise solution that I'm not entirely sure is going to satisfy South Korea, particularly South Korean conservatives. And so, when the North Koreans detonate an even bigger weapon in 5 years, I have a feeling this issue is going to come back once again, right? I mean, the North Koreans aren't going to stop, and that's what's creating the pressure, and I don't see them stopping in the future. So, yeah, the answer to your question is we'll probably end up arguing about this again in the future.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, I'd like to move on to the trilateral cooperation. Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo are reportedly arranging a trilateral summit on the sidelines of the G7 meeting scheduled next month in Hiroshima. Now, with a new level of extended deterrence commitment to Seoul, how is this expected to extend to trilateral cooperation?
Right. So trilateral is sort of like the big American expression to try to get the South Koreans and Japanese to work together better.
Right.
This is a big issue, right? I mean, your viewers don't need me to tell them that, right? I mean, this has been a big issue for a long time, right? This is a deeply divisive issue in South Korea where progressives are really, really nervous about this and really dislike it, whereas South Korean conservatives sort of want to do this, but they sort of face public opinion blowback. And so it's like a big political tussle in South Korea. But the Americans really want this, right? And the Americans are going to push for this more and more, I think, in the future, again, because the perception that the North Korean threat is growing. The North Koreans aren't stopping. They're building more and more. They're building better missiles, faster missiles, hypersonic missiles. They're almost certainly going to do more nuclear tests, which means the warheads are going to get larger and larger. China has taken a much more authoritarian, much more autocratic course under Xi Jinping. And, of course, the Russians are just, Putin is just a gangster at this point, right? Right. So, if you're South Korea, this is the American argument to the South Koreans, right? I mean, people like me make this argument all the time, right? It's like, look, you're in a really tough neighborhood. You're living next to these three autocratic Orwellian gangster states, quite honestly, that are armed up with nuclear weapons, whose foreign policy is unpredictable. They're very belligerent. And you, the democracies in the region, should be working together. And the Americans have been pounding away on this message for 20, 30 years now. And I have the feel, and one of the reasons I think Yoon's presidency is kind of important is because Yoon seems to have sort of imbibed that argument in a way that Moon Jae-in just did not. Moon Jae-in just didn't accept that analysis, right? And again, I think that speaks to the polarization in South Korea about how to respond to North Korea, right? Where right and left in South Korea have very, very different interpretations of what South Korea's national security challenges are.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kim, moving on to the economic front, the main concerns were actually over Inflation Reduction Act and Science and Chips Act. And though both presidents agreed to have close consultations on this in terms of how it affects South Korea, watchers were quite disappointed that specific details of a solution were not unveiled. How did you see this?
So the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act is very critical to our industry because the Chips and Science Act have 150 million subsidies provided to semiconductor companies that operate in the United States. But it also restricts the business activities of our semiconductor manufacturers. For example, if you have a profit more than the 150 million subsidies, then you're subject to a 75% tax for the surplus of the subsidies. And in order to ensure that you report your earnings correctly, you're subject to a separate accounting, book submission, and also you have to disclose your 10 most largest trading partners, etc. So it's a little bit too strict on our companies. And on the Chips and Science Act side, Hyundai Motors did not qualify for the subsidies because it requires the manufacturer to at least have 50% of U.S.-made components in their products, or have at least 40% of U.S. or U.S. FTA partners' materials used, minerals used in the product. So this is very critical to our companies. But I think the climate is that we're disappointed because there was not a concrete solution to this, which is critical to us. But we have to understand that a summit is the start of the dialogue. It's not the resolution of the problem. For example, when U.S. promised that they would deploy strategic assets to Korea, we don't have a specific date and time of how it's going to occur. It's a general agreement, and it's a promise that both governments will work on to resolve this problem as an ally. So we have more work to do from now. So this was just a general agreement. Now it's the time to make it work and implement the details.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, Biden has announced that he will run again in the next presidential election, and U.S. protectionism measures such as this IRA and the CHIPS Act are actually considered his major achievements. Given that, many say it could be hard for Biden to make concessions that only benefit South Korea, as other countries like Japan are also affected. How do you see the possibility of productive consultation regarding this matter in the future?
Yeah, I think concessions on trade issues to South Korea are pretty far down Biden's list of interest here. To start with, Biden's domestic coalition is somewhat protectionist, which is to say the Democratic Party has long, in America, has long relied on labor unions, just as the Democratic Party here in South Korea does, right? And labor interests are often protectionist, right? There's also sort of a growing concern, and this is bipartisan, both Republicans and Democrats are very concerned about the possibility of sort of a conflict in Asia, which would cut off the United States from technological imports out of Asia. This is most obvious in the effort to reshore, as they call it, out of China back to the continental United States, back to the U.S. mainland. But this will also affect U.S. Asian allies, which are very close to China and might get sucked into any kind of a conflict. And in this case, that includes South Korea. I think there might be some willingness to give there, right? I mean, maybe sort of in the spur of the moment, Biden makes sort of a concession, but I mean, his coalition isn't particularly sympathetic to that, right? And Biden wants to run for re-election, and sort of saying, made in America and buy America. That works, that plays, right? That plays in every country, it plays here in Korea too. So I would imagine that the Koreans won't get too much of that. It would probably, to be honest, require a united front by countries like Korea and Japan to come together. There's trilateralism for you, right? Where Korea and Japan and others sort of work together to sort of lobby the Americans and say, look, you need to sort of change the trade terms, but individually, I don't think the South Koreans will get too much.
Right. We'll just have to wait and see how Biden administration deals with this. Now, Professor Kim, two countries agreed to establish a next generation critical and emerging technologies dialogue led by their national security advisors. This will enable public and private cooperation between Seoul and Washington regarding high-tech industries. Now, why is pioneering high-tech industries so important right now, and how would both countries benefit from each other through this channel?
So we're living in a digital economy. That's the line that we have to really understand. We are very surprised by the ChatGPT technology recently, and we are seeing more amazing technology driving all sectors in the industry.
Right.
And Korea-U.S. diplomatic relationship alliance has been 70 years. We started as a country that has been aided by U.S., but now our strategic importance is at the top priority of United States because we are one of the tech leaders in the global economy. So as a digital economy standpoint, Korea is a very important partner of United States because we have leading companies such as Samsung Electronics in the semiconductor industry and Hyundai Motors in the electrical vehicle industry, and etc. But we also have a lot of technological cooperation that we should benefit from the United States as well. For example, our AI technology is grossing, but we are yet to catch up the technology standards of the United States, while we are really, really strong in engineering and semiconductor type of a high-tech industry. So there's mutual parts that we can give and take in that collaboration. And the economic alliance means that Korea and the United States will develop a technological regime to prosper in long term in this digital economy together.
Right. Now, another question, Professor Kim. Discussion on cultural exchanges was actually included in the summit, and it is mainly focused on academic youth exchanges. There will be an investment in the Korea-U.S. Educational Exchange Initiative for youth in STEM, which is the abbreviation for science, technology, engineering, and math. Now, how would these people-to-people exchanges further boost cooperation in related industries?
So the exchange package that we are discussing is 30 million, which is one of the largest single Fulbright program in the U.S.-Korea relationship. So the reason why youth is important is because building friends when you're young lasts long. So it symbolized that Korea and U.S. will get into a long-term economic alliance, especially in the very important technology sector that we have to cooperate. For example, Korea's leading universities such as UNIST or KAIST or Seoul National University frequently collaborates with MIT or Stanford or Harvard in the United States to develop the very difficult technologies together. So as a research group, we already work together, but it's really important that we facilitate that academic collaboration because in order to send our students to the United States, the receiving university has to have funds. And also for U.S. students to come to Korea, the receiving university should have funds to support that program. So that's why budget is very, very important. And what the two countries are agreeing is that youth is our future, and we should build friends between the United States and Korea to develop the very important technology together.
Right, very significant initiative as very much. Now, Professor Kelly, the Yoon-Biden summit extended the bilateral alliance in cyberspace as well. The strategic cybersecurity cooperation framework has been established, which stipulates that the two countries will not only share information regarding cyber threats, but also build a partnership for cyber training, research, and development. What threats are we facing in the cyber area, and how would such cooperation benefit both countries?
Sure, I think that's a great idea, right? I mean, cyber is really sort of emerging as a new domain out there. I mean, we work on this now increasingly in security studies. You know, you've heard from Americans. The Americans particularly worried about this a lot, right? A previous director for national intelligence once talked about a cyber Pearl Harbor. That was sort of like an expression for a lot, right? That we could have some kind of like major cyber breach and would like shut down electronics all over the country and things like that. I mean, those sorts of technical questions are a bit beyond my skills, but I think the real concern here is things like North Korean hacking, which is now very obviously a problem, right? And Chinese and Russian hacking as well, right? And we're very concerned about this. We're very concerned about Russian manipulation of social media, for example. That's become a very big issue since the American 2016 election, right? We know that the U.S. has actually done sort of cyber attacks as well, right? The U.S. has used those against the Iranian nuclear program, right? So cyber is opening and expanding as a space, and South Korea is obviously a very teched up ally, right? I mean, South Koreans are sort of good at these sorts of things, right? And so it makes sense that the U.S. and South Korea would actually work on this. South Korea has also been a victim of cyber attacks on a fairly regular basis, primarily by North Korea, right? So it's very definitely in South Korea's interest that the U.S. and it work together on these things. One way you might think about it is sort of another domain for the U.S. rock alliance to deter North Korea in the same way that we deter North Korea on land and sea, in the air, and so on. We're now going to try to do the same in cyberspace.
Right, I see. It is an important sector indeed. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's segment, but thank you, Professor Kim and Professor Kelly, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Now, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.